The microphone was right there. Not across the room, not buried under paperwork, not hidden behind some staffer, some rule, some procedural excuse, some convenient Washington fog machine built to make accountability disappear. It was right there, under Maxine Waters' hand. Close enough for the metal mesh to catch the brush of her sleeve. Close enough for the cameras to record the tiny scrape of movement. Close enough for America to hear the breath she pulled in when she thought she still had one more line left in her. And then nothing came out. That was the moment the performance ended. Representative Maxine Waters had spent decades turning microphones into weapons. She knew how to lean into them. She knew how to cut through a room with them. She knew how to interrupt, accuse, label, posture, and convert every public confrontation into a clip. For 40 years, that had been the rhythm. She spoke. People reacted. She pointed. People backed up. She raised her voice. The room adjusted itself around her. But not this time. This time, the microphone caught the one sound Washington hates more than any hostile question: silence. Sitting across the polished hearing table, Senator John Kennedy did not even look like a man enjoying victory. That would have been too cheap. He did not smirk. He did not pound the table. He did not perform some triumphant little television gesture for the cameras. He sat still, reading glasses low on his nose, two thin pages resting in front of him, and let the room understand what had just happened without explaining it. That is what made it brutal. He had not beaten her with volume. He had not beaten her with outrage. He had not beaten her with a speech written by a 26-year-old communications aide and dressed up as moral courage. He had beaten her with something far more dangerous in Washington: the record. And the record was sitting right there on the table. A few minutes earlier, Waters had reached for the microphone the way she had reached for control her entire career. Fast, commanding, familiar. The move was instinctive, the political reflex of a woman who had built an identity around never yielding the floor, never letting a rival finish cleanly, never allowing a difficult question to remain a question long enough for the public to notice she had not answered it. But the hand moved faster than the argument. The sleeve brushed the microphone. The chair shifted. The room leaned in. The camera caught the pause. And for the first time in that long, loud career, Maxine Waters had nothing useful to put into the air. Kennedy finally spoke, and even then he did not raise his voice. "Take all the time you want, Congresswoman." That line landed colder than any insult could have landed, because it was not really permission. It was a verdict dressed up as manners. It told the room that he was no longer chasing her. He was no longer trying to force her into an answer. He had already placed the documents on the table, already walked her into the question, already let her own words build the walls around her. Now he could wait, and Washington understands waiting when the other person has nowhere left to go. To understand how Maxine Waters got trapped in that inch of dead air, you have to rewind the tape 40 minutes, back to the moment she walked into that hearing room believing it belonged to her. The room was not quiet then. It was loaded, packed shoulder to shoulder, camera crews lined along the back wall, staffers standing in the margins, reporters watching with that hungry little stillness they get when they know a routine hearing might become something less routine. This was not supposed to be one more sleepy housing discussion where everyone took turns saying the right phrases, filing the right objections, and leaving with the same problems still rotting outside the federal building. Something had changed before the first gavel even fell. The word had already moved through Washington the night before. Kennedy had asked for this session personally. That matters, because when Senator John Kennedy asks for a hearing personally, somebody in the room usually has a bad document waiting for them. Not a slogan, not a tweet, not a cable news argument. A document. The kind with signatures. The kind with dates. The kind with lines people thought nobody would read slowly, out loud, while the cameras were running. And still, Maxine Waters came in like the cameras had been assembled as a tribute. She set her leather folder down with a sharp clap against the wood. She adjusted the microphone with a practiced hand. She poured her water with theatrical patience, not because she was thirsty, but because every tiny motion told the room what she wanted it to believe. Calm, controlled, untouchable. Then she looked across the table at Kennedy. Reading glasses, folded hands, gray demeanor, Louisiana drawl waiting somewhere behind a quiet mouth. She made the mistake powerful people make when they confuse style with weakness. She thought the old man was harmless. She thought the hearing was hers. She thought the fight would be about personality. That was her first mistake. When the chairman gave her the floor, Waters took it like a weapon. Before any real examination could begin, before any numbers could be read, before the folder on Kennedy's side of the table had even opened, she launched into the kind of statement Washington has rewarded for decades. Personal, sharp, theatrical, designed not to answer the issue, but to define the opponent before he could ask the first question. She reminded the room that she had spent more than 40 years on housing. She leaned hard on tenure, the oldest currency in Congress, where staying in office long enough is too often treated as proof that the people outside must be doing fine. She told the room she had read Kennedy's bill, read his quotes, and then she went straight for the television line. A clueless old man. That was the phrase she wanted clipped. That was the line meant to travel. That was the insult designed to make him look small before the questions could make her look exposed. And she did not stop there. She painted him as a man from somewhere else. A man with folksy stories and fishing metaphors. A man who had no right to lecture her about poverty, about housing, about her people. She widened the insult from Kennedy to the kind of Americans Kennedy represents. People from places she would never ask for approval. People who drive past poverty and lock their doors. People she implied could not understand suffering because they did not speak in the fashionable language of urban progressive politics. It was supposed to be dominance. It was supposed to make him defensive. It was supposed to force the old familiar Washington bargain. She accuses, he explains. She moralizes. He apologizes. She raises the temperature. He spends the rest of the hearing proving he is not what she just called him. But Kennedy did not take the bait. He did not interrupt. He did not correct her. He did not reach for wounded dignity. He let every word land on the record because that is the first rule of a good cross-examination. When the witness is damaging herself, do not rescue her. So he waited. He let the silence after her statement stretch just a little too long. Long enough for the insult to stop sounding brave and start sounding careless. Long enough for the cameras to move from her face to his. Long enough for the room to realize the man she had just mocked was not offended. He was measuring. Then Kennedy leaned forward and did the one thing she was not ready for. He agreed with her. He said she was right about one thing. He was old. And yes, he had been clueless more than once in his life. His wife, he joked, could probably sign an affidavit to that effect. The room laughed, but carefully. Not because the tension had broken, because it had changed shape. Waters had brought the insult. Kennedy had turned it into camouflage. And then he introduced himself the way he always does before the knife comes out wrapped in cotton. Just a simple country lawyer. That sentence should come with a warning label in Washington. Because when Kennedy says he is a simple country lawyer, what usually follows is not simplicity. It is a slow, patient dismantling of a person who mistook plain language for a plain mind. He told Waters there were only two kinds of questions in the world. The kind a person can answer plainly, and the kind a person spends a whole lot of words not answering. Then he promised he would ask the first kind. Small questions. Simple questions. Questions even a clueless old man could keep up with. Waters, still confident, still sharp, still believing the room belonged to her, fired back that she would try to go slowly. Kennedy thanked her. And that was when the trap began. Kennedy did not begin with the big accusation. That would have been too easy to dodge. He did not start with campaign money, family payments, federal filings, legal technicalities, or any of the ugly little numbers that make a polished politician suddenly discover the urgent need to talk about context. He started smaller than that. Smaller, quieter, almost polite. The kind of question that sounds harmless until you realize it is being placed on the official record for a reason. He asked Waters whether she knew her own district better than anyone else in that room. Of course she said yes. She said it with the kind of confidence that comes from decades of being allowed to treat tenure as evidence. She did not merely claim knowledge. She claimed ownership. She knew the district. She knew the people. She knew the suffering. She knew it better than Kennedy knew anything. Kennedy nodded. Then he asked whether she had given her life to the struggling people inside it. The renters, the poor, the people sleeping outside, the ones crushed between the cost of living and the indifference of the government that keeps pretending help is always one more bill away. Of course she said yes again. And that was the point. Kennedy was not asking because he doubted what answer she would give. He was asking because he needed her to say it herself. No staffer, no press release, no friendly interview, no edited campaign clip. He needed those words sitting there, clean and fresh, on the record, before he placed the receipt next to them. Nobody cares more than you. That was the line. He repeated it back to her, gently, almost admiringly, as if he were giving her a chance to polish the metal before he turned it over and showed the rust underneath. Waters accepted it, proudly. Kennedy told her to hold on to that idea. And that was the first sound of the door closing. Then, finally, he lifted the first piece of paper. No drama. No flourish. No big theatrical snap of the wrist. He picked it up the way a man picks up a grocery receipt when he already knows the total at the bottom is wrong. He read it to himself first, just long enough to make the room watch the paper before it heard the words. That little pause mattered. Because in Washington, people are used to noise. They are used to outrage. They are used to polished speeches dressed up as facts, and facts buried under polished speeches. But a quiet man reading from a page can make a room more nervous than a shouting man ever could. Kennedy said he had driven down a street that morning, inside her district, 43rd Street. He made a point of saying he had written the name down because he did not want anyone claiming later that he had invented it, exaggerated it, confused it, or pulled some vague image of suffering out of the air for political effect. That is how these people escape. They do not answer the thing. They attack the description of the thing. They say the critic got the street wrong, the tone wrong, the framing wrong, the intention wrong. Anything to avoid the picture itself. So Kennedy made the picture simple. 43rd Street, inside the district. A short drive from the office. Then he told the room what he saw. Not a policy memo. Not a statistic buried on page 17. Not one of those clean government phrases that makes human misery sound like a problem for a grant application. He described tents. He described the people inside them. He described counting until counting itself became shameful. He described a barefoot man in a faded Dodgers jacket asking for the time. He described the embarrassment of sitting in a warm car while human beings lived outside in the cold arithmetic of political failure. And the room changed because that is what the best evidence does. It makes the abstract visible. It is one thing to say homelessness. That word has been used so many times in Washington that it barely lands anymore. It floats. It gets filed. It gets inserted into speeches by people who leave the hearing in black SUVs and sleep behind gates. But a barefoot man asking for the time is different. A man folding a blanket with care because it may be the last piece of order he controls in his day is different. A young girl walking to school past all of it with her chin up and her eyes straight ahead is different. That is no longer policy language. That is consequence. Kennedy did not pretend he knew the girl's name. That would have been cheap, and he was not being cheap. He said somebody in that room was supposed to know it. Then he looked across the table at Waters. That street, he said, was about 9 minutes from her district office. 9 minutes. That was the number he wanted sitting in the air. Not 9 counties. Not 9 states. not some far corner of an impossibly large map where a member of Congress could say, with some credibility, that no human being can be everywhere at once. 9 minutes. The kind of distance a staffer could drive between phone calls. The kind of distance a politician could visit before lunch. The kind of distance that destroys the excuse of not knowing. Then came the question, when was the last time she had made that drive? Not for cameras, not for a ribbon cutting, not for the kind of staged visit where everyone knows the Congresswoman is coming and the backdrop is selected before the first handshake. The real drive, the quiet one, the one without applause waiting at the curb. When did she last stand on that street? That question should have been easy. For a woman who had just told the room that nobody cared more, it should have been the safest question of the morning. A date, a month, a week. Even a rough answer would have helped. But that is the thing about simple questions. They only feel simple when the truth is not dangerous. Waters did not answer. She changed the subject with the speed of a professional. She went straight for the shield she had used in hostile rooms for decades. She turned the question about a street into an accusation about identity, power, region, race, class, gender, and arrogance. She framed Kennedy as a privileged man from Louisiana, presuming to grade her on poverty. She made the room feel the old familiar pressure. Back away, apologize, lower your eyes, and let the moral performance bury the factual question. For a moment it worked. Of course it worked. That weapon has worked in Washington for a long time. It makes reporters hesitate. It makes staffers nod. It makes uncertain people look down at their hands, wondering whether asking about the record has somehow become the offense, instead of the record itself. The temperature shifted. Waters found her rhythm again. The voice rose. The finger moved. The outrage came back into the room like a returning army. She accused him of arrogance. She said he had driven down one street and decided to lecture her on a whole life of work. She tried to make the question morally illegitimate. Before anyone noticed, she still had not answered it. That was the trap. Not the street. Not yet. The trap was watching her prove, on camera, that when asked about people living 9 minutes from her office, her first instinct was not to give a date, not to offer a plan, not to name a visit, not to explain the work. Her first instinct was to attack the man asking. Kennedy let it happen. He did not interrupt. He did not flinch. He did not soften in that weak Washington way, where a politician hears a loaded accusation and immediately starts apologizing for the privilege of reading a public fact out loud. He let her spend the words. He let the room feel the force of them. Then, when she had finished, he answered with terrifying calm. "No, ma'am." He admitted he had never been the things she listed. He did not pretend otherwise. He did not try to borrow suffering he had not lived. He said plainly that he would be a fool to claim he knew that broken street better than she did. Then he returned to the question. He had been there that morning. When was she there? That is when the hearing stopped being a clash of personalities and became something much colder, because she still did not answer. And in that silence, the whole first layer of the image cracked. For 40 years, Waters had built the brand around proximity to struggle. She was the voice, the fighter, the defender, the woman who could not be lectured by anyone about poor people because poor people were supposedly at the center of her political life. But when Kennedy placed one actual street on the table, one actual drive, one actual location, one actual question, the great defender of the district could not give the room one actual answer. That is how the cage tightened. Not with a shout, with a street name, with a number, with 9 minutes. Kennedy could have stopped there and still left a mark. But he was not done, because one ignored street was not the story. It was only the door. He told the room he would let it go if it were just one street. Any honest person could miss something. Any official could fail to see one problem on one morning. Nobody can be everywhere. Nobody can solve everything. And Kennedy, careful as ever, made sure the room heard him say that. Then the warmth left his voice. Because this was not one street. This was a pattern. And the desperate people who had mailed their $25 donations, the people who believed the speeches, the people who thought the woman on television was fighting for them, had earned the right to watch somebody count the steps out loud. That was when Kennedy reached for the second page, and the paper looked thin. But the receipt inside it was heavy. The second page was not thick. That was the strange part. For all the damage it was about to do, it did not look like much. No giant binder. No dramatic stack of subpoenas. No cart rolling through the hearing room with boxes of documents piled high like some courtroom movie. Just a thin sheet of paper squared neatly on the table by an old senator who had spent the last 20 minutes letting Maxine Waters build her own pedestal high enough for the fall to hurt. Kennedy placed the second page down gently, and the room understood before he spoke that the subject had changed. He was no longer talking about tents on 43rd Street. He was no longer talking about the barefoot man in the Dodgers jacket, or the girl walking to school past the kind of failure that Congress only remembers when cameras are nearby. He had used the street for one purpose: to drag the conversation out of the cloud of slogans and plant it firmly in the district, in the pavement, in the distance between a politician's office and the suffering she claimed to own. Now he was going to follow the money. And nothing terrifies Washington faster than a calm man following the money. Kennedy began carefully. That was part of the damage. He did not accuse her of owning a nice house, as though success itself were a crime. He did not play the cheap populist game, where every private home becomes evidence of moral corruption just because a politician talks about poverty. He said plainly that he did not begrudge any hardworking person a fine house. He had one himself, he added, more or less, as long as nobody looked too hard at the back porch. The room laughed because it wanted relief. Kennedy let them have just enough. Then he took it away. The issue, he said, was not that Maxine Waters had a house. The issue was where the house sat, what the district looked like, and what the distance revealed. Her primary residence was no longer inside her congressional district. Waters answered quickly, because this was terrain she knew. The house had been inside the lines when she bought it. The lines were redrawn later. That was public record. Kennedy agreed. Of course he agreed. That was the pattern now. She would grab the legal defense, and he would politely let her hold it, because the legal defense was not always the moral defense. The law could explain the line. It could not explain the distance between the rhetoric and the reality. It could not explain the wealthy blocks, the quiet trees, the protected life, the glossy campaign language mailed to people whose streets looked nothing like the street outside the place she slept at night. So Kennedy said it plainly. The lines moved. She lived just outside them now. And every 2 years, like clockwork, her campaign mailed roughly 200,000 people a glossy piece of political instruction telling them who deserved their vote. That was when the temperature changed. Because everybody in that room who knew Los Angeles politics knew what he was walking toward. Not the street anymore. Not the house anymore. The slate mailer. Kennedy said the phrase slowly, almost like a man reading a strange product label at a grocery store. Slate mailer. He admitted he had needed it explained to him twice, being so slow and clueless and old, of course. But now that he understood it, he wanted to make sure America understood it too. Other candidates paid to get their names on that mailer. Her campaign took in that money. Then the campaign paid a private company to print and run the operation. And the company that ran it belonged to her daughter, Maxine Waters. There it was. The name hit the room harder than the number, because the name made the number personal. Money in politics is already ugly enough when it moves through consultants, committees, vendors, and friendly organizations with patriotic names printed on letterhead. But when campaign cash travels in a circle tight enough to end up inside the family system, the whole thing stops sounding like public service and starts smelling like Washington's oldest business model. Access in. Payment out. Family protected. Voters lectured. Kennedy looked down at the page and made sure no one thought this was gossip. Not rumor. not talk radio, not some anonymous whisper from a rival campaign. He pointed to the filing, Federal Election Commission paperwork, official campaign records, the kind of thing powerful people sign because they assume normal Americans will never read it closely enough to understand what it means. Over $1 million across the years, Kennedy said, from the political campaign into the pockets of the family operation. Waters exploded. She called it a racist distortion, a partisan distortion, a twisting of a legal arrangement, something the FEC had already reviewed and approved. She threw every shield she had onto the table at once, because the page had done what pages do when they are read clearly in public. It had made performance harder. But Kennedy did not blink. He did not need to litigate her outrage. He had the paper. He reminded her that it was her own filing, her own signature, her own record. And then the hearing room cracked. Not with applause, with laughter. That was the dangerous sound. Not friendly laughter. Not partisan laughter. Not the trained chuckle of people pretending a senator's joke was funnier than it was. This was the kind of laughter a room makes when the official explanation becomes too absurd to carry its own weight. People laughed because Kennedy had not embellished anything. He had simply held the document up to the light and let the shape show. Waters wanted the room to believe that reading her own filing was an attack. Kennedy wanted the room to remember that the filing existed. That is not the same fight, and she was losing the second one badly. When the laughter settled, Kennedy moved to the next number. Last year, he said, the FEC fined the campaign $68,000 for campaign money that came in over the legal limit, and for cash that went out in ways it should not have. He noted that her own campaign lawyer had signed the paper acknowledging what happened. Again, no shouting. Again, no theatrical rage. Just the number, $68,000. That number sat beside the other number, over $1 million, roughly 200,000 mailers, $25 donations, 9 minutes from 43rd Street. Each one was small enough to understand. Each one was plain enough to repeat. Each one took the grand fog of public service and turned it into arithmetic. And arithmetic is poison to a politician surviving on aura. Kennedy admitted he was not a forensic accountant. He said he could barely run his own checkbook. The old country lawyer mask came back for half a second, just enough to make the blade look dull again. But then he said he could read a grocery receipt. That line mattered because it was not really about him. It was about the voter. The American watching at home may not know the fine points of campaign finance law. They may not know the inner mechanics of slate mailers. They may not know every FEC rule, every filing code, every consultant payment, every compliance defense, every little legal lane through which campaign money can travel, while everybody involved insists it is perfectly normal. But they know a receipt. They know when money comes in from people who do not have much to give. They know when that money moves through a machine. They know when the people asking for trust live far from the consequences and close to the benefits. They know when the sermon is public and the reward is private. Kennedy took the $25 donor and placed that person right back on 43rd Street. That was the turn. The poor people were not decoration anymore. They were not a campaign paragraph. They were not a moral prop to be picked up when useful and dropped when inconvenient. They were people living in tents, walking past decay, mailing small donations because they believed somebody powerful was fighting for them. And Kennedy said what the receipt showed. Some of that hard-earned money went up the road and came back down inside the family operation. Then he did something even sharper. He acknowledged her defense. That was not technically against the law, he said. She was right about that. He had checked. That sentence should have helped her. It did not. Because the question in the room had moved beyond what a lawyer could survive. It had become what a voter could stomach. Legal is not always clean. Permitted is not always defensible. Filed is not always honorable. Washington loves to hide behind compliance because compliance sounds official. But people outside Washington have a simpler test. Would you say it plainly to the barefoot man on 43rd Street? Would you explain it to the girl walking to school past Tents? Would you look a $25 donor in the eye and say, yes, the campaign took your money. Yes, the mailer brought in more money. Yes, the operation paid the family company. Yes, the law may allow it. And yes, you should still believe the speeches. That was the human cost of the receipt. Not merely dollars. Trust. And once Kennedy dragged trust into the room, Waters understood the danger. So she went nuclear. She leaned forward and accused him of trying to reduce her entire life to 2 pieces of paper. She talked about her years, her struggle, the rooms where she had been told to wait, the doors she had forced open, the work she claimed to have done before Kennedy ever thought of lecturing her. She invoked a lifetime of service, a lifetime of fighting, a lifetime of being underestimated, opposed, dismissed, and still standing. And for a moment, the performance worked again, because she was good at this. No honest viewer can miss that. Maxine Waters did not survive in politics for 4 decades by being weak in a room. She knew how to turn scrutiny into insult. She knew how to make a document feel like an attack on identity. She knew how to take a question about money and transform it into a referendum on her entire historical significance. It was forceful. It was emotional. It was polished by decades of use. But it had one fatal problem. It still did not answer the receipt. Kennedy did not ask whether she had struggled. He did not ask whether she had faced hard rooms. He did not ask whether she had been underestimated. He asked why money from a political machine connected to desperate voters had flowed through a system that paid her daughter's company, while the district she spoke for still had streets where people lived in tents 9 minutes from her office. That was the issue. The rest was smoke. And smoke only works until someone opens the folder again. The room could feel him changing now. The folksy rhythm faded. The soft joke disappeared. The Louisiana charm, the self-deprecating lines, the harmless old man mask, all of it began to fall away. What remained was not loud. It was worse, cold. Kennedy had used patience to get the street on the record. He had used politeness to get her pride on the record. He had used paperwork to get the money trail on the record. But the final piece was not on the table yet. It was sitting in the 3rd row, and Maxine Waters had not looked at him once. The final piece of the hearing was not in Kennedy's folder. That was what made it worse. The papers had done their damage. The street had been named. The 9-minute drive had been placed on the record. The house outside the district line had been discussed. The slate mailer had been explained in plain English. Karen Waters' company had been named. The FEC filing had been read. The $1 million trail had been dragged into daylight. The $68,000 fine had landed exactly where Kennedy wanted it to land. But the most devastating receipt in the room was not paperclipped to his notes. It was a man, 3rd row, edge of the aisle, faded field jacket, rough hands, brown paper grocery sack folded tight at the top, held with the stiff grip of someone who did not come to Washington for theater, did not come for applause, did not come to trend, did not come to play the role of background scenery in another politician's moral performance. Kennedy turned slightly, and the room followed his eyes. That was when Waters finally noticed him. Not really noticed him the way a person notices another human being. Not yet. She noticed him the way powerful people notice danger after the document has already been entered into the record. She saw the old jacket, the still posture, the face that had been waiting, without asking for attention. And something in the hearing room tightened. Kennedy said the man had been scheduled to speak that morning. He had a slot, an official slot, the kind ordinary people rarely get in Washington, because by the time the consultants, lobbyists, agency officials, nonprofit executives, prepared witnesses, staff-approved experts, and professional advocates finish filling the calendar, the citizen who actually lives with the consequences is lucky to get 2 minutes and a nameplate spelled correctly. But this man had given up his time. He had surrendered his place on the witness list so someone else could speak. Not because his story did not matter. Because, according to Kennedy, he had already been trying to tell it for 3 years. That was the sentence that changed the air. 3 years. The man stood slowly, and the grocery sack came with him. He did not wave it around. He did not shout. He did not perform suffering for the room. He simply opened it and pulled out a thick, rubber-banded stack of letters. Not one letter. Not one complaint. Not one angry note mailed after watching a cable segment and getting worked up for a weekend. A stack. Letter after letter, sent to Maxine Waters' office over 3 years. Marked received, unanswered. The kind of paper trail Washington hates because it proves the citizen did not just suffer quietly. He tried the proper way. He wrote. He waited. He documented. He believed the office might work. He believed representation still meant something more than speeches, cameras, slogans, and fundraising mailers. And nobody answered. Kennedy did not need to decorate that fact. He let it sit there. The old man in the field jacket stood in the third row, holding 3 years of silence in his hands. And suddenly, every speech about compassion sounded smaller. Every polished line about fighting for the district sounded thinner. Every accusation Waters had fired across the table began to curl back on itself. Because this was not Kennedy's story anymore. This was a voter. This was the district. This was the consequence. Kennedy looked back at Waters, and his voice lost the last trace of softness. He reminded her that earlier, she had said nobody in that room cared more about where the poor and desperate people in her district lay their heads at night than she did. He had asked her to hold on to that sentence. Now, he brought it back. That is how a prosecutor closes the loop. He did not introduce a new insult. He returned to her own words. He did not claim she had no compassion. He placed her claim beside a man holding unanswered letters. He did not need to say the contradiction was ugly. America could see it. The room could see it. And worst of all for Maxine Waters, the cameras could see it. Kennedy said the veteran had written for help. He had written again. And again. The letters were received. The answers did not come. Meanwhile, the speeches continued. The mailers continued. The television appearances continued. The brand continued. The machine continued. That is Washington in one image. The citizen sends a letter. The politician sends a mailer. The citizen waits for help. The politician waits for applause. The citizen keeps the receipts. The politician forgets the citizen exists. Until somebody reads the record out loud. Waters reached for the microphone. There it was again. The old reflex. The familiar muscle memory. The physical habit of taking control before the silence could turn against her. Her hand moved toward the metal mesh. Her sleeve scraped across it. The sound was small, but in that room it felt enormous. She leaned in, opened her mouth, pulled in the breath, prepared to do what she had done for 40 years. Interrupt, reframe, accuse, overpower. But there was nowhere left to go. She could not call the letters a theory. They were in the man's hands. She could not call the veteran a tourist. He had been waiting for 3 years. She could not call the unanswered mail a racist distortion. It had been marked received. She could not call the question irrelevant. It was the entire job. She could not call Kennedy clueless without reminding the room that the clueless old man was the only one who had bothered to bring the ignored citizen into the center of the hearing. So the breath left her, and the words did not. That was the collapse. Not screaming, not chaos, not a gavel pounding for order, not some dramatic removal from the chamber, just a microphone waiting for a voice that never arrived. Just a woman who had spent a lifetime commanding rooms, suddenly trapped inside the one thing political performers cannot survive. Unedited silence. Somewhere in the back, somebody laughed. It was not polite laughter. It was not even cruel laughter exactly. It was disbelief breaking through the room's discipline. The sound people make when the spell is gone, and everyone realizes at the same time that the powerful person is no longer feared. Kennedy did not celebrate. That restraint made the moment even more permanent. He looked at the veteran. He looked at the letters. Then he looked back at Waters and let the record finish the sentence. The house, the street, the mailer, the money, the fine, the unanswered letters, none of it required shouting now. The pieces had locked together. Political celebrity is not representation. A slogan is not a roof. A committee title is not a result. A glossy mailer is not service. A 40-year career is not a shield against a 3-year silence. And a district does not live on applause. That is why the clip moved the way it did. Not because Americans had never seen a loud hearing before. They have seen plenty. Washington produces shouting the way factories produce smoke. This went viral because it gave people something rarer than outrage. It gave them a clean picture of the bargain they already suspected existed. Powerful people talk about the poor, raise money off the poor, campaign beside the poor, claim ownership of the poor, and then somehow cannot answer when one of those people sends letters for 3 years and gets nothing back. That is the part viewers recognized. They recognize the office that never calls back. They recognize the form letter that never solves anything. They recognize the politician who can find every camera in Washington, but somehow cannot find the street 9 minutes away. They recognize the elite habit of turning accountability into offense, as if reading a public record is dirty, but ignoring a desperate citizen is just politics. And when Kennedy walked away from the wreckage, he did not need a victory lap. The silence had already done the work. The veteran had already done the work. The letters had already done the work. The record had spoken. The performance had failed. And Maxine Waters, for once, could not reclaim the time. If you believe results matter more than slogans, subscribe. Share this with someone who is tired of political theater, and leave one word below.